We are very fortunate to have Ambassador James Jeffrey. Ambassador James Jeffrey is literally one of the world's leading experts. He has worked in a variety of different administrations, and he's part of what I call the professional class of ambassadors, meaning he didn't get the job because he gave $500,000 to somebody. He works in the hot spots. The people who work in the hot spots are some of the best trained people in the world. Now, Ambassador Jeffries is a distinguished figure in American diplomacy, and he's had an extensive career that spans several decades and encompasses critical roles in U.S. policy, particularly in the Middle East. Jeffrey's diplomatic service includes key postings in the United States ambassador from 2010 to 2012 in Iraq, the United States ambassador to Turkey from 2008 to 2010, and the United States ambassador to Albania from 2002 to 2004. His expertise has not only been sought in the field, but they also have been at the highest level of policy formation. He served as Deputy National Security Advisor during the George Bush administration, highlighting his comprehensive experience in both European security and Middle Eastern affairs. Beyond his ambassador roles, Jeffrey has played a pivotal role in the United States Special Representative for Syria engagement and Special Envoy to the Global Coalition to Defeat ISIS under the Trump administration from 2018 until November 2020. The position underscores his deep involvement in addressing contemporary challenges in Syria and the broader fight against ISIS, marking him as a key figure navigating complex geopolitical landscapes. After retiring from active diplomatic service, Jeffrey continues to contribute on the discourse on the Middle Eastern policy as the chair of the Middle Eastern program at the Wilson Center that he joined in 2020. The role allows him to leverage his vast experience and insights on political security and energy issues in the region, influencing current and future U.S. policies towards the Middle East, Turkey, Germany, and the Balkans. His career is also testament to his commitment to serving the United States interests abroad and his deep understanding of the nuanced dynamics on international relations, especially in the conflict-prone areas of the Middle East. His contributions to American diplomacy have been recognized through numerous awards, including the Secretary of State's Distinguished Service Award, reflecting the high esteem that he is held in. Now, my first question, the ambassador I'm going to ask him to start by giving us a better understanding, not of Israel's position, but the United States position. The real question is that I'm hoping to get from the ambassador is a discussion about what is the U.S. strategic interest, not what is Israel's strategic interest, although he can cover that as well. I certainly would like to have a discussion about his involvement with radical jihadist organizations, but there is a U.S. strategic interest. One of the things that I learned in my involvement with foreign policy at a very small level was there is a dramatic difference between values and interests. All right? Oftentimes around the world, we have a connection to people based upon a value base, other countries based upon values. I get it, everybody's now pointing it out to me, so I stopped talking. Yeah, I get that. Okay, so Ambassador Jeffrey, let me start with this question, and hopefully you can just help us understand this. Can you give us an understanding? You spent significant time in the Middle East in a variety of different positions. I've just done your introduction while we were trying to get you on. Can you give us an understanding of the U.S. strategic positions, not only in the Middle East, but how that connects to what's going on with the American world order and other global issues as well?
Okay. The Biden administration, like administrations before it, publishes a annual, semi-annual national security strategy. The last one in 2022 was very blunt. The United States is in a strategic competition for the future of the global order. This is a global order that hundreds of thousands of Americans died for and tens of millions fought for, including my father in World War II. And it has kept the world prosperous, peaceful, and politically moving forward for the last 80 years. It's under threat by a set of actors, Russia, China, North Korea, and last but not least, Iran, loosely aligned. the United States interest, and I don't mean this just in some values sense of doing good around the world, although there's nothing wrong with that, but keeping Americans safe, keeping 30 countries from trying to get nuclear weapons themselves, which could very quickly lead to a nuclear war if there isn't a collective security system that we can't stop. That's the reality. Everybody watches Ukraine. If we're not providing them assistance, then the Ukrainians themselves, who gave up nuclear weapons in '94, or others might well do so, and that's a world full of nuclear weapons, is a world that they're going to be used. So there's many reasons why American interests right at home in Arizona or Washington, D.C. are impacted by this. In the Middle East, it's a strategic area. About 1/3 of all container traffic goes through the Suez Canal. It has just short of 50% of all oil reserves, just short of 40% of all natural gas reserves in the world, and a huge chunk of internationally traded gas and oil comes out of the region. It's the home of 6 states that have tried, in 2 cases successfully, Pakistan and we believe Israel, to gain nuclear weapons. And of course, it is a breeding ground for international terror, the likes of which in the broader Middle East we haven't seen anywhere else. So it's absolutely critical for us to be present, to work with our allies and partners. This is not something that requires hundreds of thousands of troops. It requires smart military action, like our interception of Iranian missiles and rockets a week and a half ago. It requires diplomatic effort, and it requires having partners and allies such as Israel, Arab states, and Turkey. I'll stop there.
So let me kind of jump to the next question in terms of what is taking place today. So we saw in Israel that Iran had attempted to bomb Israel by sending over 300 rockets, and then Israel countered back with that. Now, fortunately, our United States Congress has acted to fund both Israel, Ukraine, as well as Taiwan. But what I'd like to know is, what do you see as the strategic importance of what happened in those bombings, as well as in the counterstrikes that Israel had?
Sure. Well, to do so, we have to take a step back. Unlike the Biden, before it, the Trump administration, and in the case of China, before it, the late Obama administration, with Russia and China, where we do recognize that they are threats to the regional and global order and trying to be regional hegemons, and we push back against it. We have not, with a brief exception of a brief period when I happened to be in government, but it wasn't my doing, it was President Trump's and Secretary Pompeo's, we have not been contesting Iran's march through the region. Iran works through surrogates. It has learned in the wars with Iraq in the 1980s and then the tanker war with us in the Gulf in 1988-89 that it will not do well in a conventional war. So it's worked through surrogates all through the Arab world. In the last 20 years, it's gained nearly effective control over Yemen, Gaza, Syria, with the help of the local Syrian leadership, Syria, Yemen, and Iraq. Sorry, my lights just went out. And it has done this, as I said, by subtle effort. What happened on the 7th of October is that a element of this alliance, Hamas, crossed the line and launched a conventional military attack on Israel. That, if it had been combined with attacks from Iran and Hezbollah, would have been an existential attack on the state of Israel. Israel responded strongly. That has led to a much more dramatic set of actions in the region since then. And so what we have now is a different situation where countries are facing each other directly. The Houthis trying to shut down shipping in the Red Sea, Iran attacking Israel, Israel responding in a careful way.
So I didn't introduce the crowd to Bob Robb, so I will do that for a moment. Bob Robb was a syndicated columnist for the Arizona Republic. He agreed to serve on this panel. He's also been on our podcast on a regular basis. I would say he was considered to be a conservative columnist during the time that he's there, but he's now doing his own thing. What's the name of the system that you would see you on, Bob?
I imaginatively named my Substack Robert Rob.
Robert Rob. What did I say? What did I say? Did I not say Robert Rob?
I thought you asked me what the name of the Substack.
No, it's the Substack. That was the name of what I was looking for. Thank you. So, Ambassador, the next question we'll take from a columnist with the Arizona Republic, Robert Rob.
It seemed to me that the Iranian attack and the Israeli response were almost calculated to have minimal effect. I'm interested in whether you agree with that, and irrespective of whether you agree with it, what you think each side was trying to accomplish and whether they accomplished it.
Yeah, both sides are trying to establish an upper limit to escalation in this new situation post October 7th. Neither Israel nor Iran, nor the biggest and most important actor in the region, the United States, want a general war in the region right now. That would mark probably the end of Iran, and it would be catastrophic for Israel, and it wouldn't be particularly good for the United States in an election year. It will also divert us from our other responsibilities in East Asia and in Europe. So no one wants this, and the idea was that the Iranians, after Israel took out essentially all of its Quds Force leaders, this is the covert, semi-covert intelligence military force that Iran uses to expand throughout the region. They were all taken out in Damascus 3 weeks ago, and the Iranians decided that they had to respond, or they would stop. They would start losing support by their surrogates throughout the region. They launched a massive attack with the intent of doing serious damage to Israel. They failed because of, first of all, Israeli reaction, Israeli defense capabilities reinforced by the U.S. and a good number of other countries. That was both a diplomatic and a military victory for Israel and the United States, and if you will, the informal alliance that exists in the region against Iran. So that was the second blow to Iran. Israel then launched a very, very smart retaliatory move. They made the point that if you strike Israel, we will strike you directly, even though the Israelis have not acknowledged that, unlike the Iranians. Secondly, they didn't do a whole lot of damage. They didn't kill anyone, and nobody was killed in Israel, fortunately. But what they did was two things. First of all, they struck close to one of the key Iranian nuclear sites. Secondly, they knocked out Iran's most advanced Russian-provided air defense system. And what they were saying is, we can reach out and get you anywhere. And the first target is going to be your whole nuclear establishment. So watch yourself. That's what they did. That was effective. I would say this, in the end, is 3-0 for Israel. 1, for taking out the Quds Force. 2, for intercepting the response by Iran. And 3, by a very clever military retaliatory move, which made an important military point, demonstrated capability without further escalation, which would have had Washington stepping on the brakes. So well done for Israel.
All right, Henry?
Ambassador Jeffrey, you mentioned that the United States finds itself in a struggle for defining or maintaining the international or global order, and that several key states, Russia, China, North Korea, and Iran, are challenging the United States in its attempt to maintain that order that has really persisted since the end of the Second World War. You said that those states are loosely aligned. How should we understand the links between those states that are challenging the American world order? Some people like to use the phrase a new Cold War. Do you think that's a good way to understand the new challenges to United States global order, or are these challenges linked in different ways?
There's a famous saying, history doesn't repeat itself, but it often rhymes. In that regard, a new Cold War is fine because it captures captures the seriousness of the old Cold War. The main difference is, and of course many of the actors are the same, 3 of the 4 we faced throughout the Cold War, North Korea, China, and Russia. The difference is the Cold War had an ideological component, communism versus, if you will, liberal democracy. There isn't this ideological element, at least on the side of the people trying to pull down the system. They're simply nationalistic. Think of the Japanese in the 1930s, the Germans in the 1930s, to expand at the cost of everybody else and to pull down any global collective security system on their way to victory. So that's what we're facing. They're allied in the sense that each doesn't want to see the other lose. If China is nervous about Russia and Ukraine, for example, it doesn't like threats to go nuclear, which Russia has made repeatedly, because China, of course, has its own backyard and 3 countries that feel threatened by China, South Korea, Taiwan, and Japan, could go nuclear very quickly, immensely complicating life for the Chinese. So it doesn't share the same interests with Russia necessarily, but on the other hand, it needs Russia as a partner, as essentially a geographic gas station in case supplies from the Middle East are cut off, and a partner to tie down the United States. Likewise with Iran in the Middle East. At one level, it ties down U.S. forces, but on the other, it threatens Chinese interests. The Chinese need oil prices kept low. The Iranians, of course, want them high because they're both under sanctions, and they, of course, are an oil exporter. The Chinese do not want sea traffic in the Red Sea cut off. So there's not a communality of interest. There's just shared interests. There is not a organized alliance as there is with us in NATO and to some degree with us in Israel. But it's still enough of a problem for us to look at it as a whole.
I'd like to understand the connection or the disconnection between the idea of what happens in our foreign diplomacy versus what's happening in politics in America. So it's not lost on, I think, most people that we end up having president after president who kind of says one thing, but we tend to be following a very different policy. I mean, if I listen to what Joe Biden was saying, I would think it would be opposing Israel today. But if I look at the policies of the United States government, I don't see where we're not almost 100% in lockstep. It seems to me that there are these multiple movements going on politically. In the Democratic Party, what we see is kind of this woke left that we were talking about on the last panel. It definitely has a more powerful influence over the Democratic side. On the right side, we've certainly seen the alt-right with the Proud Boys and the Oath Keepers, but I think a more powerful force is this isolationist movement that's happening on the far right, or on the right, I guess I should say, with the America First movement. In both cases, do you, at the diplomatic level, does that end up actually influencing you, or are we really so disconnected that and our interests are so strong strategically that we just simply keep moving ahead with what has been seen as the American world interest since the 1940s?
I'm an optimist. Well, you know, this sounds, it borders on arrogant. It isn't, you know, regardless of what the American people think, we here in Washington are just going to run the world where we, no. The American people are in charge. It's the job of people who have expertise on the subject matter, be it on communicative diseases, be it on immigration, be it on strategic policy around the world, to explain to the American people the pluses and minuses of general approaches and specific initiatives. That's what I do for a living out of government, and I had a role doing it within government, although you're more restrained. Because you follow the lead of the president, whoever he may be. But the key role that we have been playing in the world since the 1940s, and with a somewhat false start under Woodrow Wilson 20 years earlier, reflects the interests of the American people. We are separated from much of the troubles of the world by two large oceans. We are pretty self-sufficient in most things, beginning with energy and food, and technology. Nonetheless, if the world island, which is Eurasia, including the Middle East, comes under the control of one powerful country or an alliance of countries, such as we feared during World War II with Japan, Germany, and Italy, or in the Cold War with Communist China and the Soviet Union, we would be dragged into conflict sooner or later simply because that's the nature of international relations. They would see us as the last remaining bastion, not under their control, and they would have 3 or 4 times the population, 3 or 4 times the economic product, and despite our oceans, we would be threatened. So it is an interest of ours to ensure that the global island not come under the control of anybody else. As I mentioned earlier, it's also in everybody's interest that countries who feel threatened by the Russias, by the Chinas, by the North Koreas, turn to us rather than decide they will defend themselves by going nuclear. Once you proliferate, nuclear war and catastrophe is very great.
All right, Bob.
Ambassador, looking beyond the current conflict, as difficult as that is, what are the elements that would need to be in place for Israel to have sustained security and peace, largely unthreatened by its neighbors? What are the prospects of those things being put in place, and what would be the first steps towards bringing them about?
The default position that every administration except the Trump administration has taken over the last 30 years is a two-state solution. That is, Israel in its current borders, there would be some border adjustments in the various plans, given the many settlements close to the Israeli 1967 border, and a Palestinian state in the West Bank and in Gaza. This is what the UN called for in 1947 in the resolution that is basically the birth document of Israel, a Jewish state and an Arab state. And it's the only way that you're going to have long-term peace, because the rest of the region, with one major exception, the rest of the region is ready to make peace with Israel, but their condition is they want to see some kind of solution for the Palestinians. The fly in the ointment, only it's a very big fly, is Iran. As long as Iran maintains a position that it is fitting and just that Israel be destroyed as a Jewish state and that Iran is going to see to it happens, it's very hard for the Palestinian people to accept that. They're never going to come back to those areas where many of their fathers, grandfathers, great-grandfathers, and great-grandmothers lived before 1948. What we have between the Israelis and the Palestinians, in my own experience around the world, in the Middle East, and the Balkans, Caucasus, and elsewhere, Western Europe, Central Europe, is not unusual. There have been hundreds of wars in the last 150 years. There have been hundreds of populations displaced, refugees, land seized by others and such. It's a history that keeps repeating itself. Normally, countries and peoples get used to it. The Palestinian desire to reverse history is all but unique. We don't see the Serbians seriously asking to go back to Croatia, where they were ethnically cleansed by the hundreds of thousands in 1995. We don't see the Greeks demanding to go back to Asia Minor, where they were driven out in 1922, 1923. But the Palestinian goal to destroy the state of Israel is kept alive once upon a time by the entire anti-colonialist Arab mindset, but most Arab states have moved beyond this. Right now, it is Iran that provides the intellectual legitimation for the maximalist position that is the official policy of Hamas, and frankly, is in the hearts and minds of many Palestinians, even if they're not part of Hamas. And that has to change for Israel to live in peace, and that has to change for Israel to green light a Palestinian state.
All right, before I go to Henry, if If you're in group one, they're going to start the show in a little bit. A number of people have already left to go over there, but I just want to remind people who are in group one that it's time to go if you're going to watch the movie from that standpoint. Henry.
Ambassador, given that you see several, it seems quite formidable obstacles to this two-state solution, which is preferred, at least stated preferred, goal for peace for the Middle East, how do you think that Israel is going to approach the continuation of this conflict in Gaza and the post-conflict order in Gaza? What do you think is the most realistic, and then perhaps what do you think would be the ideal plan for governance in a post-war Gaza?
Thanks. It's something that I've worked a lot on. It's something that I'll be publishing and presenting soon. But I'll give you a few hints. I've also had many conversations with Israeli and American officials on this. First of all, the sine qua non for anything is the effective dismantlement of Hamas and removal from governance. That requires two things. The most obvious, and it's in the news all the time, is their final citadel in Rafah along the Egyptian border needs to be dealt with. The Israelis are planning on some kind of a major military operation that may look like its earlier operations, it may not. The United States is pushing for a much more targeted operation that avoids the high civilian casualties that we've seen in the last 6 months. But in either case, it'll involve the Israelis occupying the Philadelphia corridor right along the Egyptian border, which is the smuggling path for Hamas to get much of its weapons. The Israelis would also have to control the Rafah crossing, which is the main humanitarian crossing, and another thing that Hamas uses to govern. And it would have to move most of the population out of Rafah. The Israelis are already preparing for that. And then either wipe out Hamas in there and get the hostages back, or essentially besiege them with the understanding that Hamas has there's no end state. Sooner or later, even Hamas, despite all of their efforts underground, are going to run out of water, run out of air, run out of food. So one or the other, you're going to get rid of Hamas. But the other thing the Israelis have to do is have a stable governance of Gaza that allows the place to be built back without Hamas in charge, without the hate that we have seen on the 7th of October. The Israelis have already had problems with this. They've had to go back into the north several times because Hamas needs to reconstitute itself. The reality is that, as we learned in Iraq, the motto is clear, hold, build. The Israelis clear, they don't hold, and we're not even close to building. Before you can build, you have to hold. And before you can hold, you have to clear. Rafah needs to be cleared. The rest of Gaza needs to be better held than the Israelis are doing now. They're only keeping a couple of 3,000 to 5,000 man brigades, man and women brigades, in all of Gaza, and it's not enough to basically see any semblance of a return to normal life. So the Israelis are debating what the day after will be. They don't have a clear position because, frankly, their government is divided. The United States is for some kind of multinational presence in an interim, and then to turn it over to the Palestinian Authority. That could be a long interim because the Palestinian Authority doesn't have the management or the security capability to compete with Hamas without a hell of a lot of international help or Israeli help. They need Israeli help in the West Bank, for example. And so the multinational presence, which would handle security, humanitarian delivery, and provide that hold and beginning of build is the way forward. Israel and the U.S. are still debating this. There is no concrete plan yet. People need to be working more on this, and it's one of the priorities I know the administration has.
Ambassador, one of the issues that just seems to me to be that oftentimes happens, certainly in politics, is the oversimplification of issues that are taking place on the ground. So, if you look at how many people I think see this problem in Israel, they tend to like to simplify it. So, as an example, what many people will say that's happening in Gaza is that the Gazans have been oppressed. Yet the Gazans have been oppressed by the Israelis, and it's been from that oppression that we see this radicalism. You have spent a tremendous amount of time actually fighting jihadism or being engaged in that fight. Certainly you were the leader against ISIS. It seems to me, when I think back to 9/11, the thing that stands out to me was that this guy ended up getting 19 people to fly airplanes into the Twin Towers and the Pentagon and other places. But let's think about that guy for a moment. That guy was one of the second wealthiest people in the world. He was oppressed, right? To me, I think that is an oversimplification of what's really taking place, that the ideology tends to be more paramount. Now, leaving Gaza, going back to your fight with ISIS, can you talk to me about what you've seen with this fight against radical jihadism around the world?
You don't wipe out the ideology among those who have it. What you can do is remove them from power, demolish their military capabilities, which is what we did with the Islamic State. But they're still around. They still have offshoots, such as the group that attacked Moscow several weeks ago. And it's the same thing with Hamas. Now, there's an interesting thing. To the extent you want to make an argument that the Palestinians are oppressed or at least occupied, that's the West Bank, where Israel still operates. That is the Israeli forces, and where you have the settlers movement and various other issues that many Palestinians see as oppressive. Gaza is different. Israel withdrew completely from Gaza in 2005 and said its troops would not go back in. It demolished all of the settlements. And Gaza had an international airport. It had a port. It had access to Egypt. It had access to Israel. As you know, up to 20,000 Gazans were working in Israel. We had electricity and water brought in from Israel. What happened was that Hamas took over with the help of at least part of the population. And again, there is a deep sense of revenge and retribution among the Palestinian people for what happened in 1948. I'm not blaming the Palestinian people for this. The world is full. Every conflict I get involved in, which has been many, both sides are full of revenge and retribution. The difference is that most of the time the international community tells them essentially, sorry, we're not reversing history, move on, we'll help you move on. The Israelis, and we have said that to the Palestinians, the Iranians in particular, and before them, Saddam, Assad, Nasser of Egypt, were all saying, no, you've got to take the land back and we'll help you. And so the Palestinians have stayed frozen in history with this. It's not a grudge, it's much deeper than that. But what happened to them in 1948, now more than 70 years ago.
Bob, I'll give you the last question.
Ambassador, what effect on Israel's freedom and ability to move on the security front would the development of an Iranian nuclear weapon create? And are there any realistic approaches that would prevent that from occurring?
An Iranian nuclear weapon would allow Iran to organize a bigger version of October 7th, which would include an even bigger assault across the frontier in the north by Hezbollah, a much larger barrage of rockets, missiles, and drones out of Iran, Iraq, Syria, and Yemen than we saw several weeks ago, with the intent of destroying Israel, or at least ending it as the state we know today. And Israel's retaliatory capability on Iran would be blocked by Iran's capability to retaliate, including the nuclear weapons against Israel. That's why Iran cannot get a nuclear weapon. We have a choice. And I'll be very blunt with you in the audience. We can either say, we will do that And we can do that with conventional weapons and probably without a major war if we have to. We can do it. Or we're not going to do it. Israel has to do it. Israel will probably use nuclear weapons for the first time in combat since 1945. That's a possibility. And it will provoke a major regional war. Again, I don't have to go through the oil, gas, and container and other exports and trade that are dependent upon the Middle East being fairly stable. This is a horror scenario. Iran cannot be allowed to get nuclear weapons. And the United States should make it clear that it will take the lead in stopping it. President Biden has said that publicly when he was in Israel. He needs to be prepared to back that if Iran takes that step.
Ambassador Jeffrey, I'm going to give you the last word. By the way, thank you for being on our program today. I really want to tell you I think you spoke to me about an hour on a telephone call as we were talking about doing this, and I just received an amazing education from you. Here's the last thing I'll ask you to give you the last word. How are we doing as the United States in terms of our policy to make certain that we protect those values that you're talking about?
Look, Arizonans are fans of American football. Those people are. And that's the analogy. Pick your team, particularly pick your team when the team is really doing well. And then you take a microscope to that team and boy, you see interceptions, you see yardage loss, you see scores, touchdowns scored on them. You see a lot of blunders, a lot of foolish things, and you shake your head. But then you look at the end of the day and the team's the champion. Why? Because everybody else is worse. That's what we got going for us in the world today, folks.
True ambassador. Thank you, Ambassador Jeffrey. We appreciate having you today.
And we stand today on the edge of a new frontier, the frontier of unknown opportunities and perils. It holds out the promise of more sacrifice instead of more security. The new frontier is here.
You and I have a rendezvous with destiny. We'll preserve for our children this, the last best hope of man on earth, or we'll sentence them to take the last step into 1,000 years of darkness.